I've shown you the best weapons for each character in Soul Calibur 2. Now it's time to show the opposite. Yep, another worst thing in a Soul Calibur game video in a row. These weapons are either meh, not worth using, or oh you gosh, anything but that! Once again, if any of the ultimate weapons show up on the video, I won't say too much because I've already talked about them in greater detail when they were in DRC tiers. Also, none of the joke weapons will be featured in this video because they're not meant to be used seriously in the first place. Some of these make even the joke weapons viable compared to them. Same order as the previous video. There's going to be multiple picks on some of them. Mostly one. Mitsurugi has two worst options. Gasan deals counter damage but hurts you every time you attack, besides throwing. It's one of those generic stronger weapons that hurts you weapon. Tobal is another bad choice. The longer reach and dealing chip damage may seem pretty good, but it's ruined by the bad defense. For a neat looking weapon, it sure holds you back. The defense nerf is 35%, so you'll take plenty of damage, especially against weapons that deal more damage. Gasan at least has reasonable damage considering it deals counter damage, and you could bypass the HP loss on attack by just throwing. Both of them are for mid to late game, but still not worth using. A handful of Taki's weapons underperform compared to the kunai. Kagekiri shares the same problem as Towar besides not having a longer reach. Deals chip damage but has less defense. It's even more dangerous for Taki since she's close ranged. Fumokugi would have been my pick for her worst since that weapon has more downsides than pros. It heals her on attack but has shorter reach and takes chip damage. I reconsidered even as a runner-up, since at least the healing on attack fixes it a little bit. I'd rather use it over Yoroi Toshi, which also stinks. Similar defense nerf and soul charging makes more moves unblockable depending on soul charge level. As if soul charge wasn't risky enough. Both of their defense nerfs are what makes them her worst options. Talem's later weapons are weird. Both of them have her primary on one arm and have self-damage risk. Big Boy has a longer reach on her right hand and deals chip damage, but she loses 2 HP over time. Little Guy has a longer reach on her left hand, which doesn't make sense, and she takes reflected damage. Don't let her near the guest characters. Between the two, Sal Ankana is worse mainly because of losing health over time. Neither of them have buffed attack or even defense. Again, you could avoid the self-damage by throwing with Mali Akari. She's fine being a shorter ranged character just like Taki. Why not combine these blades instead of having one arm wasting weapon slots? It would have looked better and probably have decent effects. Oh, actually, no. That would probably kill her, so no wonder she used them separately. Here's Cassandra's worst weapon, Cat's Balger. And guess what? Another weapon with 30% defense nerf, but at least it's got longer reach. If that wasn't bad enough, how about losing HP when soul charging, which increases speed? Flimsy defense that makes you more likely to die by soul charging. Speed boosts don't mean jack shit when it saps your health. Having bad defense is one thing, losing HP while doing something that leaves you open to receive more damage is another thing. It's even worse than Ivan the Goddamn Terrible, the CPU's favorite weapon. Not much else to say other than it's a liability for Cassandra. Speaking of liabilities, Yonsung's Chen Ying. It's got nerfed attack and defense by 20%. The only upside is that it has faster soul charge. By the way, your A attacks are easier to break with B attacks. Remember when I kept bringing that up on prior videos? Yeah, it turns out that's horseshit, because B attacks will always take priority over A attacks, no matter how much damage you deal. Shoutouts to this person pointing it out. Anyway, Chen Ying is not only the worst weapon for Yun Sung, it's also one of the worst weapons in the game. Faster soul charge does not excuse this weapon for handicapping you in both ways. It's about as effective as Child's Sword. And this is a mid-game weapon. Don't let this neat looking weapon fool you thinking it's good. Raphael has a decent selection of rapiers to choose from. His later game weapon S-Stock on the other hand, isn't. It has a nasty 50% defense reduction. The original version doesn't tell you that it also has a longer reach. Soul Charge buffs attack but slows him down too. It's a combination of Schweitzer and Holy Antler but without dealing counter damage. The downsides put more weight on him than helping him. Once again, Soul Charge is too dangerous to use, especially if it makes him a glass cannon that slows him down. The speed decrease hurts him just as much as the defense nerf. For a late game weapon, it's terrible. Helix got some bad options depending on the version. Iron Staff has a damage buff that also hurts him when he attacks. At least it doesn't drain his health over time, so at least you can compromise by throw spamming. There's already a better version of this weapon called Amud. It's got the same effects but slightly more attack and deals chip damage. Even as an early game weapon, Iron Staff is too risky to use. Dual Rod has the same effects and problems as S-Stock. At least the longer reach works with Keelik unlike most of the cast mentioned. I still stand by what I said about Jingu's staff. Yes, you can utilize the long range, but it's still not that good of a weapon to use. If it had at least one more beneficial buff, I would have reconsidered. It's even worse in the Japanese version because its defense was reduced. So in a nutshell, the overseas version, Iron Staff is Scalic's worst option. The Japanese version, Jingo Staff is his worst. Xianghua has 3 terrible weapons. Card is shorter in terms of length and damage. It's one of those weapons that unlocks more unblockables through Soul Charge. What good is that when the blade is dull and short? Speaking of dull, Qixing's sword has the same problems as Chen Ying, as a longer range along with the B vs ABS. Lastly, the worst of the 3, the evil Soul Calibur variant. The counter damage and Soul Charge buff is tempting. Losing HP when charging and having lesser defense is a harsh trade-off. It's a glass cannon that shatters easily. Soul Calibur works better when it's a holy sword. The more I look at these weapons, the more I owe her Soul Calibur variant an apology. Perhaps I was too harsh on it because the evil version is abusive to use.
I ain't gonna be a whore, Inferno!
You can whore yourself on the Xianghua. Don't you deny it. But if you're gonna act like a hoe, you're gonna be one. Get in that body.
Many of Mighty Maxi's weapons are risky and have a longer reach. Chained Kosuga and Falcon are prime examples of risky longer range weapons. These are the only 2 bladed nunchucks in the game. Kosuga lowers defense and Falcon hurts on each attack but gives Soul Charge buff. Chained Kosuga is worse because of the lower defense and no other effects. At least Falcon doesn't sap your HP when you Soul Charge. Still, what's with these weapons relying on Soul Charge? Like Talamentaki, Maxi is meant to be used close ranged. The only longer range weapon that works is Fuzuroi, which I brought up on the best weapons video. Another long range weapon with lower defense. Kakekyu not only has those 2 effects, it also drains HP over time. Aside from longer reach, charging makes more of his moves unblockable. This weapon is more of a liability. The lower defense combined with the HP loss makes it one of the worst to deal with, and the Soul Charge buff could have been better instead of more unblockable moves. It's a risky weapon that not only leaves you open, it also saps you without any reward. It's about as good as committing seppuku. Nightmare has plenty of good weapons. However, his worst weapon, to me, is still his Soul Edge Complete. Losing HP over time and even more through Soul Charge is not worth the risk for more attack power. Some of his weapons have losing HP on attack, but have better benefits. The huge damage buff is tempting, but it's still not worth it. The same can be said with Ivy. Her Soul Edge variant is also her worst weapon to use. Just like Nightmare, she loses the health the same way, but the 20% attack buff isn't that good. Even her double KO weapon Change Flail is a better option than her Soul Edge. Her legendary weapon is also pretty bad, but it's still not worse. Cervantes hardly has bad weapons. Even his legendary and Soul Edge variants aren't too bad. So far the least useful weapon he got is Acheron, the same weapon he used as his primary weapon in most of the games. Here it has Soul Charge buffs but takes chip damage. Not the worst to deal with, but could have been better. At least it doesn't decrease his defense in favor of more range, or at least it doesn't sap his health when he Soul Charges. Like I said, he doesn't have a terrible weapon. Even with his Soul Edge Complete losing 4 HP over time, has a few things to make up for it. Swordbreaker is a direct downgrade. Shorter reach and less attack in favor of faster Soul Charge. It also has a Gaslight B-Break and A attack effect. And here I thought the blue Crystal Rod wasn't that good. At least with that, it heals Sulfitia and Soul Charge raises her defense. This one hardly breaks swords. Another dual weapon with faster Soul Charge that doesn't make up for it. Her legendary weapon is better because it deals more damage and its Soul Charge is really fast. Perhaps I was too harsh on Orichalcum too. Astaroth's worst weapon? Still a Soul Edge variant. Underwhelming attack buff with more unblockables through Soul Charge, and loses health over time. At least he doesn't lose more HP through Soul Charge. It's still bad regardless. Next! Baldo has 2 options, Tafana Scissors and Full Moon. The Scissors deal as much damage as Cat Claws, but has him lose HP over time instead of taking counter damage. You get Cat Claws in Chapter 1, so it's not worth using. Full Moon is worse. Losing attack power for a little bit more reach is not a good trade-off. And that becomes available in the later game, another shorter range character with a needless range boost. Using Tafana is about as fun as running with scissors, and Full Moon is about as fun as cutting steak with a plastic spoon. Sungmina's worst weapon is still her legendary weapon. The less said about it, the better. I've already said my piece when I was at the bottom spot. This is the worst weapon in the game. Hex Lumine makes all the joke weapons look good. It deals 90% less damage on hit, but it deals lots of chip damage. If that wasn't bad enough, it lowers 50% defense and even more by taking guaranteed counter damage. The downsides outweigh the only positive thing. You have to hope for the enemy to guard often in order to deal damage. It's like Tekken 1 King all over again. The lower defense is equally as bad as the low damage. If you're using this against anyone using weapons that increase attack, you'd be boned the moment you take a single hit. Necron has plenty of bad weapons, but none of them are worse than Hex Lumine. As a matter of fact, none of these weapons listed are worse than Hex Lumine. Link's first weapon you buy is his least useful weapon. Razor's Sword has a damage buff but has lower reach and takes chip damage. For someone like Link, he'll want a longer reach than Razor's Sword. Plus, there's already a better weapon with similar effects and without taking chip damage. Megaton Hammer has shorter reach but better damage. Razor's Sword isn't as bad as the other weapons listed, even as an early game weapon. Later on there will be better options. Much like Link, Heihachi's first unlockable weapon is also the least useful but not as terrible as the others. What makes it the least useful is the harsh 60% defense nerf. It deals counter and chip damage too. I remember mentioning this on the best weapons video. After using it for a while, it's sort of not worth it. This is one of those glass cannon weapons. Later on you'll find a much better weapon with similar but not as harsh effects, Tenkan Musou. It shares the same build as Link's Razor's Sword for being a temporary weapon to use. Not exactly saving the worst for last, but it's still pretty bad. Spawn's Redeemer is his worst weapon to use. This weapon was named after one of Spawn's enemies from his comic book series. About the weapon itself, there's no redeeming qualities for it. It's longer but it deals 30% less damage. Soul Charge speeds him up but loses health while doing it. Once again, the Soul Charge doesn't make up for its lacking damage, and it sure as hell doesn't help when it hurts him. It's bad enough he needs to conserve his necroplasm in order to stay alive. At least with his ultimate weapons, despite hurting him, they deal plenty of damage to the enemy. There you go. I've listed all the weapons to avoid using whenever you play Weapon Master or any of the extra modes. We went from longer weapons with paper thin defense to dealing little damage as possible while Soul Charge saps your health. If you want to see the opposite again or haven't seen it, it'll show up on the cards on the screen. Do you think these weapons are bad or not? Let me know in the comments. The legend will die if you use Hex Lumine.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more of my stuff, subscribe and hit the bell, okay? Thanks, bye.